In the early hours of Tuesday, the 30th of January, only a few days from now, the king instructed the gentleman of the bedchamber to prepare him an extra shirt, so that his shivering in the cold would not be mistaken for cowardice. The king was later persuaded to drink some wine and eat a piece of bread. Then, around 2 p.m. in 1649, Charles I of England was executed. So what, you might say? Although maybe this event is a mildly interesting historical occurrence, why bring it up today of all days, when maybe, just maybe, I don't know, maybe a bit of Australian history might be more appropriate? And I'm glad you asked. In many ways, the execution of King Charles I introduced the era of political freedom we enjoy in the Western world known as the Liberal Order. Liberal meaning free, not capital L Liberal of the Liberal Party of Australia. Because you see, the execution of the king at this point in history creates a real problem. Up until this point, really kind of starting with Julius Caesar at the end of the Roman Republic, the idea had been more or less prevalent that the ruler, the emperor, and then later the medieval kings were ordained by God to rule. They were predestined by God to rule. They lived and governed under God's good graces, and they died at God's appointed time. God chooses the king, and they rule because God wants them to. And this is pretty much accepted by everybody. That is, up until King Charles I is executed. Now what are we going to do? What does it mean for God's chosen king to be executed? What does this say about God's sovereignty? That is, God's greatness and authority to rule the earth, if we can just ignore God and kill his chosen man for the throne? English philosopher and theologian Hobbes answers this question in his great work Leviathan. The will of God as to who should govern. To prevent anarchy, the people must be governed. The will of God is made known through the will of the people. With this masterstroke of political and theological genius, the roots of parliamentary liberal democracy are born. Because suddenly the voices of the people matter. Out of it come such protected rights as the freedom of speech, the right to gather, and eventually universal voting rights. The work of Hobbes leads to the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution, and it leads to that moment when Peter Laylaw stands on a tree stump in country Victoria and yells, "Liberty!" eventually leading to every Australian, not just wealthy landowners, getting to vote. See, I told you it would come back to Australia eventually. The cry of liberty, or perhaps as we would be more likely to say it, freedom, has a high value in Australian society. In fact, some might say it is the highest value, a value which has its origins in the teaching of Jesus, the Christ, via Christian scriptures. Why, after all, did we decide that slaves deserved better treatment and ultimately freedom? Because Jesus commanded us. Even Friedrich Nietzsche, a notoriously anti-Christian philosopher, credits the ideals of liberty, of freedom, to the teaching of Jesus and his church. But herein lies the fundamental paradox of freedom, especially when we talk about freedom as followers of Jesus, our King. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Evangelion in Greek, according to N.T. Wright and other New Testament scholars, refers to God's good news, yes, but the good news of a king coming in the light of great victory. In our reading today, we have what is likely one of Jesus' typical teachings, that he has come to bring freedom. And so we understand that one of the things that composes the gospel message is freedom. But how do we reconcile this seeming paradox? The king, our ruler, brings us freedom. Naomi is a very charitable person to have married me, and her reward no doubt is in heaven, because as you may know, I'm a bit of a stirrer. Now, we have an egalitarian marriage. That is, we take decisions together, both being made equally in the image of God. But sometimes I like to tease Naomi by assuming a posture of headship. Naomi, I say, I command you as your husband. That always goes well, am I right? Naomi, as your husband, I command you. The first time I did this, you should have seen the fire in Naomi's eyes. Naomi, as your husband, I command you to do whatever you want. It's the fundamental paradox of freedom, right? Because if Naomi does exercise her freedom, then technically she has obeyed my command. Husbands in the audience, I do not suggest you try this at home. But you get the paradox. The two seemingly irreconcilable ideas. The one that Jesus is Lord, well established in Christian theology, that we are to submit to him. Not something very palatable to freedom-loving Australians. And secondly, that in submitting to the authority of Jesus, we gain freedom. And in fact, greater freedom than is actually possible anywhere else in creation. So when Jesus famously sets the agenda for his ministry and government from the scroll of Isaiah, he has sent me to proclaim freedom, to set free the oppressed. What on God's green earth did he mean? How do we serve the King, but also find ultimate freedom? To answer this question, I'm going to talk about our definition of freedom, not to skate out from under the question, but to show that in our discussion of freedom, we unconsciously actually recognize two different types of freedom: negative freedom and positive freedom. Don't be misled by the name negative freedom. It does not mean negative from the perspective that all negative freedom is bad. In fact, far from it. Negative freedom is named thus because it refers to the absence of control, authority, tyranny. This is the kind of freedom we traditionally associate with liberty in the Western world. It essentially means I am free as long as I don't have to do what you tell me. All people would accept that the people of Germany and the USSR were not free. They suffered from tyranny of the kind that we find intolerable, unacceptable. I hope. I'm looking at you, America. We all want negative liberty, freedom from an outside authority that has the power to dictate the minor and less than minor details of our daily lives. Peter Laylaw and company wanted to be out from under the corrupt authorities that ran the Victorian goldfields, who were imposing oppressive taxes and limiting the freedom of the people to fairly extract a living wage from their hard work. Last year, we spent grueling hours playing ping pong and eating thong spaghetti to raise money to free modern-day slaves from oppression. We recognise that the fruits of their labours should contribute to dignified and free living conditions. No one would call that kind of negative liberty negative in a bad sense. However, we then come to the internet, and perhaps most notably social media. On the one hand, the negative freedom of the internet, that is, the freedom to say whatever you want without consequence, led to the Arab Spring. Multiple liberal revolutions across the Arab world to overthrow dictators, Syria being the latest example. The negative freedom of the internet allowed people to gather where they could not in person to organise to throw off tyranny. But the freedom of the internet has also contributed to many societal ills. For example, the freedom to create forums to encourage anorexia and bulimia, where people can give each other tips on how to avoid healthy eating. There is the famous Terrorist Handbook, a guide to planning attacks and manufacturing weapons, that if you Google it will probably rightly put you on some kind of watch list. The rise of neo-right-wing extremism can also be attributed in part to the freedom of the internet, when such ideas can be shared and encouraged without consequence. And the fact that the tech moguls who brought us this freedom have become the richest people in human history should give us some pause as to what our participation is really contributing to. According to anarchists, unchecked negative freedom should lead to utopia. But in the end, it leads us to internet trolls, exploitative billionaires, and atomic bombs. Because, as Karl Barth has said, what happens when you empower sinful, broken people is more powerful sin and brokenness. Perhaps this is the real reason that God introduced death when he expelled Adam and Eve from the garden, so that they would not live forever in limitless human brokenness, cruelty, and stupidity. And the reality is that there is no such thing as total negative freedom anyway. We all follow somebody because we grow up around people who shape our understanding of the world. And in that sense, we submit to somebody's authority, whether it be Hobbes or Marx or Joe Rogan. We are influenced. And this brings us to positive freedom. This is the freedom that comes from knowing your purpose and place in the universe, finding your identity and living in accordance with that identity and purpose. I like to use the example that Stephen Fry uses in his book on writing poetry. Poets actually need rules in order to be free to be properly creative. If anything could be poetry, then nothing would be poetry. Poetry comes in recognisable forms, forms that are governed by things like the number of syllables per line, rhyming words or no rhyming words. Without rules to work within, bend or even break, poetry cannot use those things to be creative. If there were no road rules, you would technically be freer in the negative sense of liberty, free to have a nasty road accident. To go back to Karl Barth for a moment, we are destined to follow someone. Essentially, we are either free to be enslaved by sin and death, that is, without the boundaries that God imposes, we wouldn't even know how broken and ruthless humanity really is. Or we discover true freedom, true liberty, true purpose and identity, and freedom from slavery to sin and death in submitting to our King, the Lord Jesus. To put it another way, are you really free if you're totally given over to your own desires? Or do you quickly find yourself unable to escape from the control over your life that sex, money, power, and drugs, and all kinds of addiction have over you? Maybe you smoke cigarettes for enjoyment at the beginning, but try exercising your freedom by stopping smoking. And in fact, the Greek word for freedom in this passage actually has the sense of being ransomed, that is, purchased out of slavery. During the Nazi occupation of Europe, Dietrich Bonhoeffer discovered the true meaning of freedom. Although he was imprisoned for opposing the Nazi regime and was eventually martyred for his stand, Bonhoeffer was free in the mostly profound sense of the word. By his own definition, freedom is standing in solidarity with the oppressed, the marginalised and the hungry. Looking at you again, America. In his own words, being free means being free for the other. A definition of freedom that is reminiscent of Jesus' teaching in Luke 4. Jesus might equally have said, love God and your neighbour as yourself, because this is true freedom. This is the answer to the seeming paradox of our King Jesus teaching that he brings freedom and freedom to the oppressed. It seems counterintuitive to think that in order to be truly free, we should submit ourselves to the rule of God. But as we have heard, the absence of rule is really just freedom to be slaves to sin and death and oppressive human leaders. Jesus brings us true freedom by showing us our purpose in living, to live for the other in love and in true liberty, in giving us our identity as beloved children of God, created in his image. I don't know what the political future of the world and Australia is as we face uncertain times. But I do know that no matter what happens or who is in charge, you can have perfect liberty in the life and love of our great King Jesus.